When I discovered the Dune movie was coming out, I became intrigued in entering the world of Dune again. Last year I read the first book and really enjoyed it, but I hadn't read the entire series and thought that it was a good excuse, even though the movie doesn't cover it, to read the rest of the series. I think a lot of people are going to be in this situation where after the Dune movie comes out, they're going to think, is the Dune series worth it? No matter who you are, I say the first book is worth it, but I finally chose to pick up the whole series, and I'm gonna let you know who I think the series best caters. I really don't actually think the Dune series is for everyone. I think it's for a little bit more niche of an audience, so follow through the aspects of this video and decide if this is something that you would want to spend time doing. The first thing that I feel like a lot of new readers might not know if you're going in blind is that the Dune series is actually multi-generational. So you might fall in love with Paul from the first book and hope to see Paul in the rest of the series. That doesn't necessarily happen. I was reading the series blind, just knowing that I loved the first book and wanting to just go in and see what everything was about. I was a little bit surprised when there was a 12-year gap between book 1 and book 2. So imagine how shocked I was when I picked up book 3 and 4 and realized that the gap between Children of Dune and God Emperor of Dune is 3,500 years. And then it doesn't end there, but between God Emperor of Dune and Heretics of Dune, we have another 1,500. So if Dune is the right series for you, you're a reader who's okay going into a story that spans millennia and doesn't just follow one person. This means that if you're kind of one of those readers that likes to follow one person or a couple people internally very thoroughly and have that deep connection with characters, this doesn't really offer that. You will get a connection with some characters, but it's just not going to be to the same level as some series that follow the same characters throughout the entire thing. You'll actually feel that some of the characters are kind of keeping you at an arm's length, and the whole series wasn't really designed for that small-scale internal emotions of one character only. Because it has more of the large-scale base as a series, it's going to give you more insights into human nature, written history, and political machinations more than it will things that you see in a lot of series where you get deep in with one character or one family. This is so much more than that. Along with this, and because of this, from book to book, you're going to be having to learn a lot of new characters. So sometimes it gives you a little bit of you have to have a little bit of time and adjustment between books, because when there's a 3,500 year time gap, you can assume from that there's not going to be a lot of the same characters, so you're going to have to learn almost everyone every time. So if you're going to read the series, I recommend going a little bit more thoroughly into it, learning the characters. I actually looked up some guides to help me. There's just a lot from book to book to book to constantly learn, and it doesn't necessarily have a smooth pickup from one book to the next. Another thing to keep in mind if you get into the series, especially if you're going to compare in your head to other big sci-fi films like Star Wars, is there's not really an aspect of good versus evil. Of course, we follow a hero-like character, Paul, in the first book, but the whole idea of a hero throughout the series is tipped on its head. There's no one who's only good and no one who's only bad. It's a little bit more subtle than that. Paul doesn't remain an undisputed hero through the entire series. Even the rule of tyrants is shown in a light that could be positive at times. There are a lot of factions in the series that have different ideals, and you can't just choose a faction because, I don't know, there's positive and negative sides to everyone. And even the best paths that humanity can take sometimes aren't always ideal, even if they're the best option available. So the whole idea of there's going to be a good outcome or a good versus evil or something to easily root for is not something you'll get in the series, which I think will attract a lot of people, but can also detract from it if you are someone who wants someone who's clear to root for. That's not really something that this will offer you. Another thing that I think is useful to know before you get into the entire series is Frank Herbert plays a lot with sages. And with sages, I mean, he has different characters that through different means, sometimes through birth, sometimes through some type of ritual, get almost omniscience to where they know a lot. They know what's happened in previous lives, they have previous lives living within them, and they just have a lot of knowledge. So because of this, Herbert is able to use these characters who through different means have lots of acquired knowledge in order to show his ideals and his philosophies. Some of these omniscient or almost omniscient characters almost approach the status of God, so if you kind of prefer the books that give you characters that are coming from nowhere and along their path, their hero's journey, they become something great, this series just has a lot of characters who start off all-knowing. I think some readers will definitely like this idea of having sages within these books, people who know a lot, but I can also see some readers annoyed with the fact that some characters are just supposed to be full wisdom, know everything, and impart their wisdom to you. I can see some people getting annoyed with that for sure. So I figured I'd mention it. This series also takes a stance on human nature, and it doesn't put human nature in the most positive light. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the darkest you can find, but I mean, it's a little bit more complex, to where the idea that you'll see presented in this book is humanity left to its own devices will destroy itself. I guess that actually is pretty dark. The idea is that we pay lip service to peace, but we're constantly getting into conflict and constantly sowing the seeds of conflict throughout society, and that has to be mitigated through different efforts taken in the book. Each person and each faction is doing things to improve their lot for themselves, and the meddling of these factions leads to a lot of things that could be ultimately destructive for humanity. Manipulation is often used. You might see some people messing with religion and other things to manipulate powers that be into their favor, and because of this, I feel like if you're a reader that has a more positive view of human nature, you might not love this, but if you're someone who likes to see the darker elements of human nature, likes to see the parts where you are fighting for yourself, for your faction, through different tactics that are not always great, this is a pretty good series for examining human nature in that lens. Going with this, there's a lot of politics and power plays in these books where you're going to see these factions, and sometimes if you're not someone who wants to keep up with lots of factions, there are lots of factions in this book, so keep that in mind. Each faction wants something different, and they use different means to get it, but they spend a lot of time with their philosophies and discussing what they're going to do. Because you're looking at the ideals of these factions, you're seeing plotting and plotting and plotting in different books, there is a lot of dialogue. I would also say there's an above average amount of just straight monologue from characters, especially these sages I'm saying. So if you're a reader that doesn't like to just see people talking all the time, people are talking all the time. People are saying lengthy things, they're giving their philosophy, they're saying how they see things. So keep that in mind before you go in this book. I know some people don't just love huge dialogues, huge monologues. That's something that's going to be present as people talk about their ideologies and their philosophies within these different factions. However, conversely, if you like getting lost in the ideals that different people or different factions may have, this would be a positive aspect of this book. So decide for yourself how you view a lot of talking. Something that I think is really cool about this series is because it spans millennia, you get to see evolution of history and how history is viewed as well as religion. So you're going to see events from earlier in the series portrayed in a new light later on in the series because thousands of years have passed and we've held on to the history that people think it's important and people have thought to use to their advantage. Different analysis of history useful to the things later on in the books. So if you like to see the evolution of history and how history is remembered over time, this book is pretty interesting with that. Along with history and closely tied to history, we have evolution of religion. Religions change over time, different religion events are remembered differently over time, different things are emphasized over time depending on the faction that's kind of trying to use it to their advantage and depending on what is useful to humanity going forward. One thing I will add is that religion in the series is portrayed as man-made and easily manipulated by the forces that be, so if that is something that would annoy you, maybe steer clear of this. But if it's something you find intriguing, I thought that the evolution of religion and using religion for the needs of different factions was really cool. This series has a huge strength in world building. I can't say anything negative to say about the world building. Not only does he create an immersive universe where you really get a sense of place, but it changes over time. You see ecological changes throughout the books as thousands of years pass, and you see different changes in how the universe works and functions and different rules that happen over time. So the sense of place and the world building, not just this first initial world building, but the evolution of world building, is amazing and really interesting, and I don't see why anyone would see that as a bad side. That's actually just something that I think we'd all enjoy. Another thing I'll say clearly in favor of reading the series is it is heavily rereadable. If you're someone who likes to get really deep into a fan base of a series and have lots of different revelations every time that you reread a series or that you look at a series a little bit more closely. This has a lot for you to go after. This has a lot that you can learn, a lot to dig through, a lot to analyze with friends. So if you like to read a series to kind of have a fan base to talk about it with and learn something new every time, this is very rereadable, and I know I missed a ton in my first read through. There definitely are places to talk about this series. Not every series has that. There's a huge fan base, so obviously there's a good subreddit, there's even a Discord, there's a lot of active members. So if you want something where there's community to read a book or series, this definitely has a community already there for you to jump right into. I do think something important to know, very important to know before you pick up the series, is that after Chapterhouse DUne, Frank Herbert dies, I think the age of 65. So this is not a finished series. Chapterhouse DUne, while you finish it, you know that there's something else that's supposed to come. His son says that the first 3 books were supposed to be a trilogy. God, Emperor of Dune was supposed to be a book in the middle to basically bring the trilogies together through the events that happen in this book. Then there's supposed to be 3 books to make a trilogy at the end. As you can see, there's only 2, as the author died prematurely. His son in the 2000s actually wrote a couple books to try to finish it off for him, but most fans don't really see that as canon. So it's kind of a series that never was finished. So you have to be okay going into a huge amount of reading, knowing that there will never be a clear resolution, knowing that it's never going to be finished the way the author intended because of a premature death. Another thing that I think is important to mention is obviously these books were written through the 60s to the 80s. So that means that they're not always going to be perfect in portraying modern values we have right now. You do need to have a little bit of patience as a reader if that's something that really concerns you. There are a couple questionable LGBTQ quotes. There is a role for women, like a traditional role for women that is basically throughout the series. That being said, there's a lot of powerful women in the series, so that's honestly a little bit ahead of its time, but it still has like a traditional view of how women are just because of the time it was written in. Overall, I don't think that the author made any huge mistakes as far as our modern ideals in these books, but you have to give them a little bit of slack for being written in the 60s to the 80s. So if that is something that is going to bother you, just keep that in mind before you pick it up. So that's all I have to say on if you should pick up the Dune series or not at the moment anyway. If you've already read the Dune series, give your feedback down in the comments. What do you think is important for new readers to know before they get started, or if they choose to get started at all? If you're thinking about reading the Dune series, let me know what you feel about reading it down in the comments. Does it seem like something that's for you, something that's not? And of course, give this video a like and consider supporting me on Patreon. Have a great day.